She had no idea the man she just slapped could shut down her entire airport. And he did. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Flight attendant Claire Reynolds, 38, stood stiffly in the aisle of first class, her hand still raised. "Sir," she sneered, "you don't belong here. Get back to where you came from." The man she'd just slapped didn't respond. He didn't raise his voice or plead his case. He just slowly turned his head back toward her, a fresh red mark glowing across his cheek. Around them, the cabin was frozen. Mouths hung open. The woman in 3C whispered, "Did she just hit him?" A businessman near the bulkhead pulled out his phone, too stunned to even press record. What none of them knew, not Claire, not the passengers, was that this wasn't just a random old man in a wool coat with a paper boarding pass. This was Walter Greaves, 78 years old, the former federal infrastructure director, the man who designed and still controls the Blue Signal framework, the security protocol that grants or denies flight clearance to 17 major U.S. airports. And Claire had just slapped him. Walter didn't flinch. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black flip phone. It looked outdated, forgotten, but the 5-digit code he typed into it would ripple through the national flight grid in under 5 minutes. He pressed send. Up in the cockpit, a soft ping sounded. The captain blinked at the incoming message. Authorization delay, clearance anchor, overridden, FAA manual hold. Back in first class, Claire smirked as she turned away. "Some people just can't take a hint," she muttered. She had no idea the real turbulence was just beginning. Tell us where you're watching from, and ask yourself, what if your father or grandfather got slapped for simply sitting where he belonged? Because in 5 minutes, 3 airports will shut down, and no one on this flight will ever forget what just happened. Walter Greaves didn't look like someone important. He didn't wear designer loafers or carry a sleek roller bag. He didn't walk with the swagger of someone used to being noticed. He wore an old navy wool coat, polished but aged, and carried a leather briefcase that had clearly traveled more than most people ever would. His first-class boarding pass? Printed, not digital. Claire had glanced at it earlier and practically rolled her eyes. "Who still carries paper?" she'd muttered. But Walter Greaves didn't care about appearances. He never had, not when he was working in federal infrastructure, not when he was consulting at the Pentagon, not even now, years into retirement, living quietly in a small coastal town in Maine. The truth was, he liked being invisible. He'd flown commercial dozens of times over the past year, not because he had to, but because he believed in seeing how the system actually functioned. You couldn't understand the real condition of a network by reading a report. You had to be inside it, among the people it served. That's why he always booked the same kind of flight. Early morning, first class, direct. He wanted to observe the crew, the passengers, the system. This morning, he wasn't expecting conflict. He'd chosen his seat, 2A, just like always. Checked in at the counter, showed his ID. Nothing unusual. Until Claire Reynolds intercepted him at the first-class door like a security checkpoint. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't even said, "Good morning." Just a sharp, "Ticket and ID." Walter had handed them over, calm as always. But the way she squinted at his license, the way she said, "You're far from Maine, huh?" with that edge, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't looking at credentials. She was looking for a reason. And now, because she'd found one, Walter was about to show her exactly how wrong she was. "Stay with us. The skies are just starting to shake." It should have ended when he showed his ticket, but it didn't. Even after Walter calmly handed over his first-class boarding pass and his Maine driver's license, Claire Reynolds wasn't satisfied. She held them up to the cabin light like she was scanning for hidden ink or fraud marks. Then she squinted at the ID again, as if the name Walter Greaves didn't sound first class enough. "This seat's in first class," she said slowly, her tone heavy with condescension. "Yes," Walter replied, evenly. "That's where I'm seated." Claire didn't back down. Sometimes passengers get confused, especially with paper tickets. He didn't rise to it. I assure you, I'm not confused. That answer, calm, polite, certain, made her jaw tighten. Walter could feel it. He'd seen this kind of posture before. It was the look of someone who didn't just want to be right. They needed to prove someone else didn't belong. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice, but keeping the edge sharp. You really expect me to believe you're flying first class dressed like that? That was the moment. He felt the air change, the burn behind his ears, the way two passengers paused mid-conversation across the aisle. Everyone heard it, even if they pretended not to. Walter still didn't move. He'd dealt with moments like this before, in conference rooms, in congressional hearings, in rooms full of suits and power where people judged him by how quietly he carried authority. He wasn't going to react the way she wanted. He wasn't going to argue, or explain, or plead. He was going to let her cross the line all by herself. And when she did, when her open palm cracked across his cheek, it wasn't just an insult to him. It was a declaration of arrogance, of assumption, of unchecked entitlement. She thought he was some nobody from nowhere. But now, Walter had all the reason he needed, and all the clearance he needed to change everything. Walter sat back in his seat, slow and steady, like nothing had happened. His cheek still burned, but he didn't touch it. The physical sting was nothing compared to the insult, the kind of humiliation that lodged itself in your spine and stayed there. Claire had walked off, smug, convinced she'd won something, as if shaming an old man in public was some kind of victory. Walter didn't flinch. He didn't look for sympathy. He didn't expect it. He just reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Tucked beneath a folded Wall Street Journal was a small, worn black flip phone, the kind no one used anymore, except him. It wasn't connected to any personal account. It wasn't even traceable through commercial networks. This phone existed for one reason only: clearance override. He opened it. The screen flickered, blue against gray. A prompt blinked at the bottom, AUTH 8th ID. He typed in his 5-character authorization, then scrolled through a short list of options. His thumb hovered briefly over one line: disengage, blue signal anchor verification protocol, temporary hold. He selected it. A second prompt appeared: confirm manual hold. Walter paused, just for a breath, then tapped yes. From a seat near the back of the plane, a subtle ping echoed through the control tower in DC. A technician glanced at his screen, confused. The clearance anchor for 3 major airports, TPA, DCA, and LAX, had just dropped offline. No signature, no warning, just offline. Back in first class, Walter closed the phone and slid it away. He didn't look angry. He didn't gloat. But he did glance toward the galley where Claire stood chatting with another flight attendant. She was laughing now, holding a paper cup of coffee like nothing had happened. She had no idea. She thought she'd slapped an old man. She had just triggered the largest unscheduled airspace review since 9/11. The captain tapped his screen twice, frowning. Strange, he muttered. His co-pilot glanced over. What is it? We just lost blue signal clearance for our arrival into Tampa. The system's blank. The co-pilot squinted. That can't be right. TPA's a hub. Exactly. The captain leaned forward and tried again. Same result. Authorization key unavailable. Anchor verification suspended. Up in first class, the atmosphere had returned to its usual hum, or at least it looked that way. Claire stood at the front of the cabin pouring black coffee, casually chatting with a young couple in 1A like nothing had happened. But several passengers had seen everything. And Walter? He hadn't moved an inch. He was calm, unnervingly so. Eyes closed, arms resting on the armrest like a man in quiet reflection. But under that stillness, something was building. Not rage, not revenge. Calculation. Back in the cockpit, the radio crackled. "This is FAA operations. Be advised, Blue Signal Framework is reporting a manual anchor disruption. Systems at TPA, DCA, and LAX currently on temporary hold. Reroute instructions pending." The captain blinked. "Wait, what? That's 3 major airports." He glanced down the cabin log and asked, "Did anyone important board this flight?" The co-pilot checked the manifest. "Just a handful of first-class regulars. Nothing flagged. One guy from Maine. Greaves, Walter." The captain's eyes widened. "Greaves?" he echoed. "Walter Greaves?" The name hung in the cockpit like a cold front. Meanwhile, Claire strutted down the aisle, her walk as sharp as her attitude. She threw a glance toward Walter's row, a look that said she still didn't buy he belonged there. He didn't even look up. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a pen, clicked it once, opened a small notepad, and began writing. Not a complaint, not a threat, a report. Because Walter Greaves didn't file incidents, he triggered federal investigations. "Tower, this is Eastgate 217 inbound from DC. Confirm landing slot at TPA." Silence. Then, "Negative. Eastgate 217, Tampa clearance suspended. Holding pattern recommended. FAA reviewing." The captain's stomach sank. 3 minutes earlier, everything was routine. Now Tampa International was refusing entries. And not just them. 2 more towers, Reagan and LAX, were reporting the same thing. Same message. Same eerie lack of detail. "Clearance anchor unavailable. Temporary hold. Await Blue Signal review." At the FAA Regional Ops Center in DC, alarms were lighting up across the Blue Signal monitoring interface. 3 major U.S. airports had dropped out of compliance. No external breach, no cyber attack. The problem came from inside the system, through a manual anchor override, and that override came from Walter Greaves' ID. By the 5-minute mark, incoming flights were being rerouted. Private jets were grounded. Commercial aircraft were circling. Internal emails across airline HQs read one line in bold. "Contact FAA. Confirm Blue Signal status. Something's down." Inside the plane, Claire was still oblivious. She walked briskly through the aisle again, collecting trash and handing out forced smiles. Her tone with Walter hadn't changed. Curt, clipped, thinly veiled disdain. "Are you done with that drink, sir?" she asked, eyes flicking over his notebook. Walter looked up, his voice quiet. "I'd recommend you sit down, Ms. Reynolds." Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You may want to strap in," he said evenly. "The turbulence you're about to feel isn't from the weather." At first, she laughed it off. But then came the captain's voice over the intercom, tighter than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been advised of unexpected air traffic delays affecting Tampa and other major airports. We'll be entering a brief holding pattern." Claire's smile dropped. Walter turned back to his notes, crossing a line of text and rewriting it carefully. From that seat in 2A, he wasn't just documenting a rude flight attendant. He was logging the first minutes of a systemic failure. And Claire? She wasn't in control anymore. 3 airports were stalling, the skies were shifting, and the ground was about to shake. "Wait," the captain said again, gripping the control yoke. "Did you say Walter Greaves?" The co-pilot glanced up, now visibly concerned. "Yeah, that's the name on the manifest." A thick silence settled between them. "I sat in a debrief with him once," the captain finally said. 12 years ago, Pentagon side. He was consulting on something called Blue Signal," the co-pilot finished, eyes widening. The two stared at each other for a moment. Neither said the obvious. He wasn't just a consultant. He built it. Back in the FAA Operations Center, a separate terminal lit up. Someone in the Oversight Division had finally run the ID trace from the override command. Within seconds, a high clearance alert flagged the code as belonging to Walter C. Greaves, former Federal Infrastructure Director and current authenticator of the Blue Signal anchor system. The room snapped to attention. "Get the administrator on the line," someone ordered. "Already tried. He's en route to Capitol Hill." "Then get defense liaison, now." Meanwhile, on the plane, Claire began to sense it. Something shifting. Passengers were murmuring, texting. Cabin crew were quietly checking cabin status with furrowed brows. The Wi-Fi had flickered and then gone down. Claire tapped the cabin phone, but it gave a hollow click. No signal. She made her way back to the front galley, and that's when the intercom beeped. The captain's voice came through, sharper this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just received notice that we will not be landing at Tampa. We're diverting to Jacksonville International. This is due to an unexpected systems audit affecting regional airspace." Claire turned pale. Systems audit? The only time that term was used mid-flight was during federal emergencies. And still, she didn't know. Didn't know that while she was pouring orange juice and doling out napkins, the man she humiliated had triggered a silent chain reaction reaching the FAA, Homeland Security, and Defense. In 2A, Walter opened his phone one last time. A short confirmation buzzed. "Anchor hold confirmed. 3 nodes offline. Emergency briefing requested." Then came a ping, a private message. "Is it retaliation or reform, Walter?" He replied with one line. "It's reminder." Back in the cockpit, the name Walter Greaves had reached the airline's executive crisis line. Within 2 minutes, the airline CEO's personal assistant interrupted his golf round with a quiet but panicked whisper. "Sir, we may have just slapped the man who controls our federal airspace access." And that's when everything stopped being a misunderstanding and became a crisis. By the time the plane began its slow descent into Jacksonville, the airline's legal department was already drafting press language. The headlines hadn't hit yet, but the signals were clear. TPA, DCA, and LAX, 3 of the top 10 busiest airports in the country, were on active audit hold. No arrivals, no departures, no explanation to the public. Behind closed doors, federal agencies scrambled to contain the fallout. FAA administrators held a 3-way call with Homeland Security and the Department of Transportation, their tones clipped and urgent. "He used a CLEN-line authentication," someone reported. "Manual override, valid signature. We can't block it without violating the Blue Signal framework." "And who authorized that framework again?" a second voice asked, irritated. "Walter Greaves." Silence. Then someone said what no one wanted to admit. "He can shut down half the Eastern Corridor if he wants." Inside the plane, passengers were tense. Phones buzzed with failed signals. A few started noticing something strange. Ground crews weren't present when they landed. No announcement, no welcome, just the plane sitting there, silent, sealed. Claire paced near the cockpit, biting her lip. Something felt off. The senior flight attendant, Mark, pulled her aside. "You need to come clean. If something happened with a passenger—" "I didn't do anything wrong," Claire snapped. "He got aggressive, disrespectful." Mark stared at her. He's sitting in 2A, calm, quiet, never said a word. Claire's eyes darted toward Walter's seat. Still there, still dignified, still terrifyingly calm. Meanwhile, inside FAA command, a private line buzzed on the administrator's desk. It was Walter. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply stated facts. "You have 6 hours. Either enforce the dignity protocol we proposed 12 years ago, or the next phase of Blue Signal rolls out. And this time, I won't be the only one pressing send." The administrator swallowed hard. "You're not bluffing." Walter's reply was even. "You've had over a decade to prove otherwise." Back at Jacksonville Airport, a black SUV with no markings pulled onto the tarmac. 2 federal agents stepped out. They didn't go to the cockpit. They didn't go to the tower. They went straight to seat 2A. Walter stood slowly, calmly collecting his coat, his notebook, and the flip phone now powered off. He didn't speak until they reached the bottom of the stairs. Then, with the agents flanking him, he turned to the gate supervisor, a young woman in a red blazer holding a clipboard, frozen in place. He gave her a nod and said simply, "Have the captain contact Washington. He'll know why." And just like that, he disappeared into the car. In the crew galley, Claire was still trying to piece it all together. "What's happening?" she asked a junior crew member. The girl looked at her, eyes wide. "You didn't hear?" she whispered. "That man, he's the one who designed the clearance system that just froze 3 airports." Claire went pale. The seat she'd tried to deny? It belonged to the man who could erase her airline from the sky, and she'd slapped him like he was no one. Within 6 hours, the headlines exploded. 3 major airports frozen, FAA silent on cause. Was this a cyber attack or a civilian override? Who is Walter Greaves? Inside the airline's corporate headquarters in Dallas, the boardroom was in chaos. The CEO, Grant Kessler, stood at the head of the table, jaw clenched, sleeves rolled up. Legal, PR, ops, and compliance teams huddled around laptops, trying to make sense of the data. It wasn't a hack, the CIO confirmed. It was a legitimate override, clean authentication, Tier 1. The legal counsel leaned forward. "And it originated from one of our flights?" "Yes, Eastgate 217. Passenger Walter Charles Greaves." Someone dropped their pen. Kessler turned pale. "Wait, that Walter Greaves?" He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his phone and called a private line in DC. Someone who owed him a favor. The answer came fast. "If you're calling about Greaves, don't. He's already triggered the blue signal clause. We're under audit. Homeland and DOT are in full compliance." "You mean to tell me," Kessler said, barely breathing, "that one man can shut down our East Coast operations?" "He can do more than that," the voice replied. "And now, because your crew decided to humiliate him, he will." Meanwhile, across the country, internal memos raced through federal agencies. All commercial flights operating under blue signal authorization were ordered to submit behavior logs and compliance tapes. FAA dispatched 14 audit teams to review service behavior, passenger mistreatment claims, and pre-existing complaints. And at the center of every brief, one name, Claire Reynolds. Her record? Spotty. Previous citations for tone. One informal complaint 2 months earlier. No formal disciplinary action, until now. The footage was clear, her voice raised, her words demeaning. The open-handed slap undeniable. Walter had never retaliated physically, never raised his voice. But his system? It was already speaking louder than she ever had. At the Jacksonville airport, Claire sat in a small HR interview room, her face pale, fingers shaking. Her union rep sat beside her, quiet. A regional director walked in with a folder and said one sentence, "You're being placed on indefinite leave pending federal inquiry." Claire didn't argue. She couldn't. She finally understood. But his system? It was already speaking louder than she ever had. She hadn't just slapped a passenger. She'd slapped the man who wrote the rules. And now, the sky was rewriting itself, without her in it. Justice didn't land with noise. It touched down in silence and grounded her future. 3 days later, the aviation industry was on fire. Multiple airlines were now under ethics review. A new temporary protocol, called the Greaves Standard, had been rushed into effect by the FAA, requiring all carriers to submit passenger treatment logs, crew behavior evaluations, and a formal response plan for all in-air incidents involving first-class passengers. For many, it was an inconvenience. For others, a nightmare. But for Walter Greaves, it was simply overdue. Back in Washington, D.C., inside a secured federal briefing room, Walter stood before a small group of senior transportation officials. No cameras, no press, just decision makers. A young deputy secretary broke the silence. "Mr. Greaves, respectfully, what exactly do you want?" Walter set his phone on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I want the skies to have memory," he said. "If a passenger is mistreated, especially one with no power to defend themselves, That shouldn't vanish with the landing gear. I want every airline to be held accountable for who they let represent them." He slid a binder across the table labeled Flight Conduct, Equity and Oversight Proposal. It outlined a permanent policy based on passenger rights, behavioral ethics, and a scoring system that would link directly into Blue Signal's clearance matrix. Airlines that didn't comply would not just lose funding, they'd lose access to the sky. Meanwhile, news outlets across the country were catching on. Walter Greaves, former federal director, quietly forces ethics reform on U.S. aviation. Retired official shuts down airports. Public cheers his push for passenger rights. The skies have memory now. A new era of flight accountability begins. Walter didn't speak to the press, but his impact did. His proposals were adopted within 48 hours by 5 major U.S. carriers. 2 international alliances began requesting meetings, and a bipartisan group of senators drafted a motion to make the Greaves standard federal aviation law. As for Claire Reynolds, her name was flagged in the first wave of training audit suspensions. Her license wasn't revoked, yet, but she was removed from active flight duty, barred from reapplication for 18 months, and placed under formal ethics review. The union declined to appeal. Her mistake hadn't just been the slap. It was assuming no one important was watching. At a quiet cafe in Arlington, Walter sipped a black coffee by the window, watching planes take off in the distance. A younger man approached, FAA staffer, maybe early 30s. Nervous. "Mr. Greaves, just wanted to say, that moment on the flight, the way you handled it, it changed how we look at our job." Walter gave a small nod. "We're all passengers in someone else's story, son. Sometimes we just need to remind them we've flown this route before." The young man left, and Walter turned back to the window. His flight was boarding in an hour. This time, no one questioned his seat. No one asked for ID. No one raised a voice. And no one ever would again. Some revolutions don't roar. They click open from a quiet flip phone and rewrite the rules at 30,000 feet. 1 week later, the industry was no longer the same. The FAA, alongside ICAO and the U.S. Department of Transportation, held an emergency summit in Geneva to address a growing demand. If airlines wished to retain international certification, they would now have to integrate the Passenger Dignity and Fairness Index, a framework that had been sitting dormant for over a decade. It had a new name now, the Greaves Accord. And this time, there was no ignoring it. The Accord introduced a mandatory ethics rating system for both flight attendants and airline procedures, scoring airlines on how they handled real-time complaints, crew conduct under pressure, and treatment of at-risk passengers. Walter didn't attend the summit in person. He didn't have to. His name was on every page, his digital signature on every clause. And when the vote came, not a single country objected. It passed unanimously. In a press briefing that followed, the FAA administrator stepped up to the podium. No political spin, no sugarcoating. "We failed to act on this a decade ago. That won't happen again. From this day forward, access to our airspace comes with a condition. Respect." He paused. "We thank Mr. Greaves not just for his service, but for reminding us that silence is not consent." Across the industry, changes came fast. Airlines began retraining their entire first-class cabin crews. New internal watchdog teams were installed. Behavioral surveillance software, developed years earlier but shelved, was reinstated. Cabin interactions were now being scored and logged, not just for compliance, but for ethics. Passengers noticed the shift. There were fewer, "Ma'ams, I need you to calm down," speeches, fewer glances of doubt, more apologies offered before passengers had to ask, more respect. At the same time, several whistleblowers who'd once spoken out against cabin discrimination found themselves reinstated. One had sued a major airline for racial targeting. Her case had been stalled for years. Now, settled, publicly, with an apology. For Claire Reynolds, the ripple effect hit hard. Her name was permanently listed on the first public-facing crew ethics watch list, a non-punitive database tracking suspended crew for verified misconduct. She wouldn't fly again. But that wasn't the real sentence. The real consequence? She became a case study. In flight schools across the country, instructors now teach a new module titled The Greaves Incident, when one man grounded 3 airports and lifted a standard. It's not taught as a cautionary tale. It's taught as a turning point. Because what happened at 30,000 feet didn't just change a flight. It changed the skies for everyone. It was a calm morning at Reagan National. Walter Greaves stood quietly at gate C-14, holding nothing but a small leather briefcase and a boarding pass. Seat 2A. He wasn't escorted. He wasn't announced. He simply waited in line like everyone else. But this time, the flight attendant at the gate didn't question his seat. She greeted him with a calm nod, then stepped aside. "Mr. Greaves, welcome aboard. We're honored to have you today." Walter gave a small smile, nodded once, and walked on board. The plane was quiet. He passed a young black couple in row 4. The husband looked up, recognized him, and gave a small, grateful nod. Walter nodded back. No words needed. In 2A, he eased into his seat. A fresh glass of water waited at the armrest. No assumptions, no condescension. Just the quiet presence of respect earned, not requested. Across the aisle, a teenager sat with earbuds in, scrolling through the news. He paused on a headline. Greaves Accord now adopted by 27 countries. Industry shifts toward passenger ethics reform. The boy glanced at Walter, then looked down again, eyes a little wider. In the front galley, the lead flight attendant adjusted her blazer and whispered to her coworker, "That's the guy who rewrote the rules. We use his name in crew training now." As the plane pushed back, Walter looked out the window, watching the tarmac drift. No anger, no ego, just clarity. He didn't need cameras or applause. His legacy wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence of systems behaving better, the silence of passengers not having to explain themselves, the silence of respect, finally default. As the jet lifted into the sky, no one knew this was his last flight, and that's how he wanted it. Because real power doesn't demand attention, it just takes its seat and never gets questioned again.